Welcome to the Mother-Daughter Empower podcast, a show that provides moms with the tips, tools, and resources that they need to raise the next generation of empowered girls. I'm your host, Tara Filto. Now let's get started.
So much, everyone, for joining us today. On today's show, we have Lori Gray. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And Lori, you save the world one life coaching at a time. I love that. And you work from your home in Los Angeles, and you're a veteran homeschooling mom and life coach. I stumbled upon your Instagram page, and I was very, very curious about what you do. And I thought that it would be very beneficial to our members and our moms and daughters, because you specialize in the logic behind our emotions. So please tell us a little bit more about what you do, how you kind of fell into that field of work, and what it's all about.
Absolutely. Yeah, super fun to be here. And I've tried for a while to find like the language to describe what I do. I mean, that Instagram bio probably changed like once every month for a really long time, right? Because when I started coaching, so I mostly actually started as a health coach. So a huge part of my story is that I have a really intense health journey. And I'm not sure about your listeners or your audience, but I know like statistically a lot of moms do deal with some version of health issues, especially something about after that second baby, right? Like rise of autoimmune conditions. But anyway, so I, during my second pregnancy, I experienced the really extreme onset of a genetic condition. I didn't know that I had, like there were symptoms, but I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It's a connective tissue disorder. And so pregnancy combined with that, combined with other things, basically I spent 5 years bedbound and in a wheelchair. And the doctor said like it's permanent and it's degenerative, but I didn't really accept that as an answer. I'm a little stubborn in that way, but I'm like, no, like there's something. I did a lot of work. I found my own answers. And so, I basically got my life back. I've been out of my wheelchair for, I guess now at this point, almost maybe just a little bit longer than I've been in it. I think I've been out of my wheelchair for about 5 years. And so what happened initially was people saw I was in a wheelchair and I wasn't, right? But then also I did still have like limitations, daily pain, limited energy, but I didn't seem to hate my life. So so I just basically started getting a lot of questions like, can you help? Can I give your number out? This sort of thing. And I'm like, sure. And then actually all that happened was like I met with a coach because I'm like, I've got like all these people coming to me. I don't know what to do. She said, it sounds like you're a coach and you're not getting paid for it. And I was like, what is coaching? That sounds fantastic. How do we do that? Sign me up, right? And so all these people who had just been coming to me for questions, I was just like, hey, do you want to do this like officially and pay me some money? And they said, sure. And I'm like, great. And then I was a coach. So anyways, we started doing it more officially, but I discovered really quickly. So my initial crowd was a lot of moms. Like at this point, my roster's really varied. But there were certain things that I saw a lot. I found that whether we were talking about health or whatever we were talking about, people thought they needed like the how-to, right? Like they thought they needed like a formula.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because I would come in and I would give people the formula. It's like, well, yeah, we just do this, like this. We just do it this way. And then they would come back and they hadn't done it. And really, I just started getting very fascinated by how does this work? And I'm one of those people, I'm an abstract thinker. I like to understand things, and realizing that what people were doing or what they were not doing was 100% emotionally driven.
Mm-hmm.
But then working backwards from that of like, what I realized with emotions was that so many people were confused by them, terrified by them, ignoring them. And either they were highly emotional people that were just reactive all the time, or they had had some sort of experience where they just shut it down altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was either like all emotion or like no emotion was like how they, right? And then they were just very confused because they might have a thought of like, okay, this would be good for me, but then they weren't doing it, or I'd like to stop doing this, but then they couldn't. And I think that ultimately when I looked at my clients, I feel like so many of them were confused by their own behavior. They were confused by how they were showing up. And they had a lot of emotions that they didn't really know what to do with. And a lot of these women were very smart. Like, I feel like a lot of them were like me, like they were driven, like type A kind of people, super smart, very successful in every other area of their life. And then there's these like emotions are like, I don't know what to do with these. So I started initially for myself, like what are emotions like? And I ask my clients these a lot, like we'll get to the root of things and find out that it's emotionally driven. But I'm like, okay, but what is an emotion? And they're like, I don't know. I have no idea. Like they can't articulate it and yet they're terrified of it. Right. So this concept that we're afraid of what we don't understand. So for all my clients, we spend time understanding emotions in general. We understand them on a scientific level so we can actually wrap our brain around what is happening and see that that's really what's driving everything. But then we also trace it back because all of our emotions, or most of them at least, are driven by a thought that we're having, a way that we're interpreting the world. And so I have this system that I use where I help people just distinguish all these things. I help them see like the very neutral, factual thing that happened in the world, understand the thought that was triggered by that circumstance, where that thought came from, why they think that way, why they've adopted it, what that's creating emotionally, how that's driving their behavior. And we actually, you can see my whiteboard back here. I use my whiteboard and we map it out where they can see it visually and understand it. Because I think it always makes sense. Our assumption as moms is that the reason is that there's something wrong with us. And I just show people it's never that. It's like there is a sentence in your brain that we had that's creating some emotion that's driving this action, and it means nothing about you. That's kind of like if I had to like sum up my entire coaching practice, that is it. And it takes on a different flavor for every situation. But I'm like, guys, there's like a sentence in your brain. It's creating an emotion, it's driving a behavior, and it's no big deal.
Into perspective, and so powerful, I think, because like you say, often as moms, life is crazy, it's busy, and then all of a sudden, we get upset or we shout, and then it's that guilt, that constant guilt. So it's interesting to really kind of go back and pinpoint where is that actually coming from. And I think that's when you can really start to create some real change, right?
Absolutely. And that's like a lot of my clients, that's the very first step, is to just stop judging ourselves for what's happening. Because here's what happens. Like we get angry at our kids, but then we're angry at ourselves for being angry at our kids.
Yes.
And then suddenly we have twice as much anger, twice as much negative emotion, right? Or it's like we find ourselves like judging someone and then we judge ourselves for judging them, or we feel anxious and then we get anxious about the fact that we feel anxious. And yes, and like that compounding. And so one of the first things is being able to just acknowledge like, yeah, I had a thought and I got angry. And not do that part B, like not do that thing where it means something about us, not do that part where we beat ourselves up for having a very common human reaction, but just to like, let's just skip that part. Let's skip the part 2 and just go back and understand ourselves and our behavior from a place of non-judgment. And then we can make progress. But it's hard, right? Like we're very much trained and conditioned to beat ourselves up or feel guilty about things. And so I spend a lot of time with clients just helping them drop that part 2. And half the time when we do that, suddenly everything's more manageable because it's half as much negative emotions to deal with.
Yes. So can you walk us through an example? A mom walks into the kitchen, there's, the kids are in the cereal's on the floor. Her tween daughter doesn't want to do her homework and is saying it's too hard and she's ready to blow. So in that situation, what would you recommend? What are the steps? Can you take us through the steps of what a mom should do?
I can try. and we never do. I'm very careful to avoid shoulds. I know that's how we talk about things, like what should we do? But so I'll present this as an option of what could happen. Yeah. Now, I always present this too in the sense of whatever we have practiced the most is what's going to happen for a while.
Yes.
So usually what I start with is like after the fact, the cereal was spilled, the daughter didn't want to do homework, and basically we kind of like lost our mind, right, and probably freaked out a little bit. um, the first step usually is waiting till like after the fact and going back to understand the situation. But whether it's in the situation or afterwards, with something like that, we have to find the thought that's making us feel whatever it is that we're feeling. So it's interesting because sometimes it's really often just a very seemingly innocent thought of like, my daughter should do her schoolwork without complaining.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a really logical, basic thought. And yet, when that's not the reality of our situation, we suffer for it. Because if we say she should do school with an attitude, with a good attitude, but she's not, where in the world are we supposed to go from there?
Exactly.
But I'm like, what if we just didn't have that thought? And like, rather than looking at what is and saying it should be different, I think one of the very first things is just to accept that like, this is the nature of my reality right now. Like, there is cereal on the counter and my daughter doesn't want to do her homework. And we don't say it shouldn't be that way. Like, it is that way. That's acceptance. Acceptance is it is this way. And then we move into empowerment, which is now what? Who do I want to be in this situation? How do I want to think about this? How do I want to feel? How do I want to show up? How am I going to speak to my kids? And we make intentional choices about what we can control and stop trying to control what we can't control, like our kids' emotions. Like, they're allowed to feel whatever they want to feel. They're allowed to think whatever they want to think. And they're humans too, which means they're going to make mistakes and have bad days and hard days and all of that.
Yeah.
When we can just accept that as like, this is what's happening.
For what it is. Yeah.
Now what? It changes the narrative, right? Where we can, and I think it allows us to drop into typically often like compassion and empathy. Like, if we're not so busy being angry and judgmental, it's like, if we just don't even have the thought it shouldn't be that way, like it is this way, it's so much easier to drop into solutions. It's so much easier to drop into empathy, so much easier to drop into compassion. But those things are blocked. Those things aren't available to us when we are looking at what is and arguing with it. We just can't even find them. But like, if I'm in that situation, it's like my daughter doesn't want to do school. I'm like, I hear you. Like, I totally get that. I think we can all relate to sometimes not wanting to do our work. And whenever I can connect with the part of me that understands her emotion, then I can start to offer solutions. It's like, would you like to hear what I do whenever I don't feel like doing my work? Would you like some options? And I can just make that available, or I can just let her have a bad attitude. But it puts it back on what I can control and off of what I can't.
Interesting. That is so powerful. It's really, really coming back to what you have control over, right?
Exactly.
Within in that moment. And this is a situation I can't change what just happened. I can only control how I'm going to react.
Exactly. Yeah. Because anything that's in the past, I don't know about you guys. I mean, I'm this person. I always want to know whose fault it was. I want to know how it happened in the first place. And I can get really, I can go to a very unhealthy place in my own mind. And sometimes I do want to understand it, because it's like, okay, can we learn anything from this? But again, like, if I am in a calm space and like a more accepting space of like, once the cereal is spilled, it's spilled.
Yep.
That's it. Like, it's over. We can't go back and undo it. It is just spilled.
Yeah.
Now what? And it just moves into, and part of the now what is going to be practical. It's going to be cleaning it up, but then it might be going back and like, and sometimes I just ask my kids, like, do you know what went wrong there? Like, my eldest, we have like a water filter with a little spout thing where the water comes out. And like, pretty consistently she misses and like just misses her cup, and it goes all over the kitchen floor. And like, for a while I got frustrated, but now I'm just like, do you know what's happening? She's like, yep, I was thinking about my book. I'm like, okay. And like, that water just gets spilled about every day. And I was like, okay, what am I going to think about this? And we've like, as a family, we're just like, this is fantastic. We almost never have to mop the kitchen floor because, you know, she spills enough water that she just It's like, hey, yeah, when you clean up that water, just go ahead and do the rest of the kitchen floor. Like, we're good to go. And I'm just not frustrated by it anymore, because before I was having this thought of like, babe, just pay attention, right? Like, just pay attention. And I'm like, you know what? She's a creative.
Yeah.
She's always going to be making stories, and that's beautiful. And I'm like, okay, so the water's going to spill sometimes.
I love, it's such a simple story, but it's and we should let our viewers know you have two daughters, 10 and 13.
I do.
mentioned.
10 and 13, two girls. Yes. So we got all the stories. We got all the experiences. We got
It's great to see, like, it's such a simple example with the water, but I think that we can all as moms relate to that, where there's our kids do certain things like over and over and over again, and we're always trying to change it. But then what happens if we just accept it for what it is?
yeah.
And at the end of the day, if she spills a little water every day, really, what?
Right. I mean, and sometimes there are really like logical, like empowering, things that come out of that. Sometimes, now, if it was something that was like dangerous, like that's fine. But
Yeah.
it's interesting because I'm like, do I really need to control this? Like, is this a place that this needs to change? Is it really a big deal? And it's been fascinating. Like, I'm a control enthusiast. I definitely would like for everybody to do things my way. But yeah, but with my kids, there's a number of things where I'm like, this really is okay. Like, this isn't hurting anybody. This is fine. But it was really just that thought that it should be different that made me struggle, instead of just, okay, this is a thing that happens sometimes. 'Cause I mean, I spill water sometimes too, right? And I'm like, okay, it's fine.
It's a really great question that you just brought up. Do I really need to control this? I think
Mhm.
that's something that we don't ask ourselves enough, right?
Right. It's, because as we look at it, when our kids are newborns, right? We really kind of do need to be in control of a lot. But even then, I think it's powerful to recognize that from day one, we don't have as much control as we would like. We
Mm,
cannot make them babies eat or fall asleep or there are certain things that, or be quiet or not be quiet. We're like, from day one, there is stuff that we cannot control. And then by the time our kids are adults, to be in a healthy relationship with our kids, once they are adults get to make all their own decisions, like completely zero control from almost 100%. And which means that, like, over time, we have to give it back. And I think that a lot of us, and I've been guilty of this too, sometimes holding on to control longer than I really needed it.
yeah.
And I'm always just, again, curious with myself, because if that's the action or the behavior that I'm taking, that I'm keeping control of a situation, I always want to go back and ask myself why, and see if I like my reasons for it. Because some of the reasons are, guys, when we get really honest with ourselves about this work, sometimes we just discover some stuff in there where it's like, ooh, I don't like that. Where it's like, okay, this is a very simple example, but my kids like clipping their own nails, right? Like, that's a skill that when they're babies is on me, and then by the time they're adults is them. So at some point it gets handed off. I kept control of that one longer than I needed to. And why? Because I didn't want my kids to go in public and have dirty, unkempt nails. I thought that was gross, but here was the thing. Here's where I had to be honest with myself. It was because I didn't want somebody else to judge me. It was about what I thought they would think about me. And when I realized that, I'm like, that is not a good reason. That is not a reason that I like. That is not a reason to keep this. And that's when I knew it was absolutely time for them to take that, to take it on, to learn it, to do a poor job at it for a while, because that's how they were going to learn.
Yep.
So yeah, it's very interesting to see how much of what we do really is about us and what we want to feel or what we want other people to think about us. I had to get really honest with myself about a lot of those things.
I'd love to touch upon, because I know a lot of our viewers will be, by the time they watch and listen, the kids will be back at school. And so I'd love to touch upon your thoughts when it comes to um, school and how much pressure we put on our kids to do well across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes, as you stated in your example, a lot of times it comes back to kind of almost being selfish.
Yeah.
I mean, when you really look at it, there's so many different subjects, and I know there's a lot of parents out there that put a lot of pressure on their kids to do so well in everything. So yeah, I'd love to get just your thoughts on that. Do you think that that's a good question to ask as well, even when it comes to school? Do I really need to be controlling this?
Yeah, I think it's really powerful because I do think a lot of us try to get our kids to perform a certain way
Mm-hmm.
because of how we will feel and how we will think about ourselves and what we think that means about us. And I think that that is often happening for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have to clean all of that up. And that's why I always talk to people with like parenting. I'm like, I really feel like for, parent-child relationships to go well, whether it's homeschool or anything else, we have to clean up our own thinking and motivations first. And a lot of that requires being really honest, because sometimes we can have these very altruistic, like sounding thoughts on the surface, but we don't really get below it to figure out why that, because we'll say it's like, well, yeah, I just want them to do well in life, right? Like I just want them to get into a good school, I just want them to have this. But then we have to ask ourselves, why do you want that?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that's important? And I think so many of us have anxieties about the future, and it's like, what if, are we picking a path for our kids that isn't theirs? And I don't know, like, I don't want to give too many examples, but it's just always really important when it's like, well, I just want this. And it sounds really basic, but I'm like,
Yep.
but why do we want that? And if that doesn't happen, why is that a problem for you? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where does this come down to? And whenever I let go of those things and really decided that whoever my kids decided to be and whatever they decided to do, that I would support them and love them unconditionally, and basically dropped my agenda
Mm-hmm.
for my kids' life and really decided that like my worth and value were not affected by this.
Yep.
And did all of that, then it was so much easier to approach it, because I like what you're saying here too with school, because it's just one measure
Mm-hmm.
of intelligence. So with my kids, my kids are very different. My 10-year-old is, she performs well on standardized testing because of where her intelligence lies. She always looks ahead of the curve, and it looks really great on paper.
Mm-hmm.
My eldest is an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Through and through, she is an artist. She has very high spatial intelligence. And what she can do with it's like, there's just like and I noticed this when she was like 5, where she would like set out a toy and then could freehand it in like correct proportions and understand what it looked like from the back and all these sorts of things. Very, very talented. Also has dyslexia. And then you give the kid a math test.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look good on paper. Like it doesn't look good on paper. And so, but whenever I dropped my agenda and really just started looking at her, it opened up some really beautiful conversations. And we talked about, I don't know if you're familiar with the theory of intelligences, but there's this, that there are like different intelligences. And we looked at them, and she was able to look at them. And I'm like, okay, so I have very high, like abstract, like mathematical stuff. I've got pretty high kinesthetic. I'm pretty high, like interpersonal. My spatial intelligence doesn't chart. Like I have none. It doesn't work. There's like 0, right? Yeah. And so I showed it for myself, and she could see it in me. This is when she's like maybe 11.
Yeah.
And then we looked at hers, and she was able to see that some of the things that I was high in, she was low in, but her spatial intelligence was through the roof.
Yeah.
And we brought more language into this,
I love
right? Like we brought more language, and now she knows she's very high spatially intelligence, but
Mm.
she's also able to accept within herself that, and I've modeled this for her where I'm like, yeah, this is what I'm high in and this is what I'm low in. And I think that that's perfect. I think that I have the giftings I need to do what I'm called to do in the world. And I'm like, what about you? She's like, well, yeah, I don't really need that to be an artist. This is what I need. So she was able to see that maybe she was put together perfectly as well, and that it wouldn't all show up on
I,
a
I
test.
love that. And I love that we touched upon that because I think far too often there's this box and just from like society's expectations and as parents we try so hard because we feel like if our child doesn't fit into that box, then that looks bad upon us
Exactly.
in some you know way. And so
Yeah.
it's really interesting. I will try to find a link. Maybe you can share a link with our viewers to kind of do some of those tests, or if there's a website to share with them, because I think that's very interesting. And it really just goes to show that we're all so unique and we all have these unique talents that need to be highlighted in different ways. Um,
Yeah.
and
And yeah, and it's super good too. And also just to say for, for viewers too, sometimes I think the best thing with this is just to get really curious and like ask a lot of questions, because my because sometimes it just comes down to so many things. Like sometimes it's learning styles, sometimes it's genuinely just a thought that they're having. Because once we understand this work for ourselves, how our thoughts creates our emotions and drives our actions, we can help our kids with it too. And like I always think starting with the parents, but my youngest was kind of resistant to math, even though she's really good at it.
yep,
And we went through and like I just asked questions, I got really curious, and she like one of the thoughts was like, well, it just takes so long. And I was like, okay, how long is so long? She's like, well, if I struggle with it, it might take me a half an hour. I was like, okay. So we're talking maximum 30 minutes. And once I understood that that was the thing, that like she had a thought that math took a long time. And as humans, anytime we have a thought that something's going to take a long time, we dread it,
yeah,
right? Like we
yeah,
have that sort of dread. So I was like, oh, okay. And then suddenly for me, it clicked and it made sense. And then we were able to shift the conversation to something helpful, because I was like, okay, so how long does it actually take? 30 minutes. Great. So now we're in the realm of facts, not subjective judgments. And then I asked her, I said, do you know how long public school kids spend on math every day? She was like, no. I was like, about 60 to 90 minutes. And
mhm,
her eyes got real big and she looked at me. So I was like, so the facts are, even on your longest math day, even the stuff that you struggle with and you have to go back and rewatch and like really work through the problems with mom and dad, you're still doing half of what everybody else is doing.
yeah.
And I was like, what do you think about that now? She's like, not such a big deal. 30 minutes sounds great.
Perspective, right?
Right. But instead of just like getting mad at her for not doing math, I went back and understood the thinking enough. And then all I did, like, I still can't control how she feels, but what I can do, the greatest thing I think we can do as parents is offer our kids different thoughts. I'm like,
Mm.
did you know this? Like, would this be helpful to you? And like, I just offer things. It's like, and if you thought about it this way, how would you feel? She's like, well, I definitely wouldn't dread it. I just sit down and get it done. That's not bad at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But I would have never got there if I was, busy storming around and being mad because my kid's not doing math the way that I think that she should.
Yeah, no, I love that you share that. And it's really like, it's like the example of the onion and the layers, just really finding the root of the issue, because even to offer, different examples or to offer different ways to support, if you truly understand where it's coming from, then that helps us as a parent to really, offer our support in different ways. So I love that you touched upon that. That's amazing.
I love it.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy to have you on today. You gave some wonderful examples. So I want you to share, if our viewers want to reach out to you directly, how can they find you? Um, Please share away.
Yeah. Okay. So, different ways you can connect with me. I am on Instagram, Coach Lori Gray, and my website is lorigray.com. And really excited, like the timing of this podcast. I'm not sure when this will come out, but with back to school every year, I get so many questions about these kinds of things. And so I actually just finally, something that was on my to-do list for ages, sat down and recorded a course on emotionally mature parenting, and what it looks like to be an emotionally mature parent, so that we can then teach these skills to our kids and interact with them in good ways. So you know, you can definitely follow me for free on Instagram. But if this sort of work is really interesting, that is something that's there. And I made there's like an hour of just free material there with some like major mindset shifts. But yeah, so those would be some great ways.
That's great. So I'm sure we'll have lots of our members that'll be able to check that out, and very, very beneficial information that you shared with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course, this was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. Don't forget to sign up for our free monthly mother-daughter membership, which gives you instant access to our members-only Facebook group, monthly empowerment toolkit, and much more. Sign up today by visiting www.motherdaughterempower.ca. See you soon.